Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. Goodness gracious, weird things going on here. Um, if you'll be patient with me for just a moment, I'll try to solve the problem.
Goodness gracious, weird things going on here.
I'm getting all kinds of feedback. There is why. There. So sorry. All right, so welcome to From the Stacks again. I'm Cal Beisner, the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, and I'm glad you joined us this evening. Our title for tonight is The Mouse That Squeaked, Reflections on the Glasgow Climate Summit. And the reason I put it that way is that there were great hopes for what the Glasgow Summit would do in terms of cracking down on carbon dioxide emissions, but we dodged a bullet. It wound up managing to do very, very little, and there were all sorts of really interesting reasons for why that's so. COP26, that climate summit in Glasgow, was a top international news item from late September through its conclusion on November 13. What did it accomplish? What does it mean for you? Why did it achieve so much less than organizers hoped? And what does that portend for future climate change international negotiations? Our guests tonight, James Taylor, President, and Jim Lankley, Vice President and Director of Communications of the Heartland Institute, two good friends of mine, were in Glasgow and followed the conference closely. They'll discuss these and more questions on From the Stacks tonight. First, let me just mention, this is the tail end of your opportunity to get a wonderful free book. The book is my good friend David Fowler's book, Restoring the Constitution Using the Ninth Amendment to Recover Civil Liberty. And this is a wonderful book, a very clear and well-written book, not for experts, but for laymen like you and me. And if you are concerned about the degree to which our constitutional liberties have been abridged, to which government has been overstepping its bounds, and you want to learn ways that you can actually work together with your state legislators and even local officials to turn back the United States Supreme Court's overstepping of its bounds, and that really does happen, by the way. If you'd like to learn how to do that, I'd encourage you to get this book. You can receive one totally free as our way of saying thanks when you make a 100% tax-deductible donation of literally any size, doesn't matter how small, to the Cornwall Alliance. To make your donation and make your request, just go to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button. And as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just enter promo code 21-11 or the title, Restoring the Constitution, and we'll be glad to send you a free copy. But this offer ends at midnight tonight, so please be sure to act quickly. Actually, we'll stretch it out for a few days if you need to do that. So if you ask for it anytime in the next week or so, we will still do that for you. Okay, getting on to tonight's subject, the mouse that squeaked, not the mouse that roared. We're looking at the Global Climate Summit that took place in Glasgow, ending a day late on Saturday, the 13th of November. These things usually end a day late because it just seems like the bureaucrats who gather together for these things never can be efficient with their use of time. And so they always tend to come right up to the last minute and then say, we'll spend a little more time on it. And so they go overboard in the attempt to get some sort of an agreement. In this case, the agreement that came out, to say that it lacks teeth is perhaps an understatement. To say that it still, though, poses some dangers to you and to me and to people all over the world, because it will encourage governments to continue with harmful energy policies that will increase the cost of living for everybody, that will slow, stop, or even reverse economic development for the very poor around the world, that will delay the time when roughly 1 billion people in the world who currently have no access to electricity begin to get it. These things could all still stem from what came out of Glasgow. Our two guests this evening are James Taylor, the president of the Heartland Institute, and Jim Lankley, the vice president. And these are both friends of mine. Very glad to have you both on the show. Thanks for joining us. Uh, why don't you each give me just, or give our listeners just a couple minutes of introduction of yourself. Tell folks about yourself, starting with James, who,
All
by the
right. Well,
way,
thank you, Cal.
is not the James Taylor, the famous musician, but he's a great guy.
But when I was young and single, it came in handy. Thank you for having me on. It's truly a pleasure and an honor. I'm the president of the Heartland Institute. We are a nonprofit public policy organization based in Chicago. And our mission is to discover, develop, and promote freedom oriented solutions to the problems that confront society. I joined Heartland in 2001. I joined overseeing energy, environment, and climate issues. So, as president of Heartland, I'm still plugged into these issues, and especially, as you mentioned, the incompetent bureaucracy of the United Nations that rears its ugly head every year come November or December.
And Jim Lankley, tell us about yourself. Jim, are you muted?
Gosh, I'm so sorry about that. Hi, I'm sorry. My name is Jim Lankley. I'm the Director of Communications, who communicates so well. I forgot to take my mute button off. And the Vice President and Director of Communications here at the Heartland Institute. Before I joined Heartland in 2008, I spent 16 years as a journalist. I say that, I admit that, I should say, with much trepidation, because the profession of journalism has such a low reputation, well earned. But I should say it's mostly since I left that profession. And I was able to help run the counter conference that we ran in Glasgow, Scotland at COP26, called the Climate Reality Forum, which I'm sure we'll get into referencing a little bit here today, where we were able to put on 2 full days of counter programming to the alarmist. In fact, it was basically the only scientific programming at all in the entire country of Scotland during the COP was by the Heartland Institute, where we had scientists and policy experts from around the world to talk about what they didn't want to talk about at the COP, which is the fact that human activity has some effect on the climate, but it is not causing a crisis, certainly not one that requires the complete reordering of our societies in a very totalitarian way. So it was very inconvenient for them, but we tend to show up to a lot of these to make sure that the world knows that not everybody agrees, that we have to give up our freedom to, supposedly save the planet.
Yeah. Jim, you just referred to what they're doing as necessitating a complete reordering of human society, of the way we do things. That's a pretty big claim. Why do you put it that way?
Because I pay attention to what they say at the United Nations, at these Conference of the Parties meetings and other places. Look, it's happening here in the United States. The Green New Deal is all part of this. It's basically the domestic version of the globalist climate agenda, which is not about controlling the climate. We can't control the climate. It's not possible for humans to control the climate. But what governments can do, and they've proven very, very good at this, especially in the 20th century, is controlling people, controlling populations. That's what the agenda of the United Nations is, and they're using a contrived, a phony climate crisis caused by humanity to give the justification to control our economies and to control our way of life and to tell us where and how we can live. And, the Heartland Institute was founded in 1984, not to push back against that specifically, but to preserve our freedom, to preserve our liberty. And so we find that, I think the Heartland Institute it should be no wonder we have a lot of fans around the globe. Of course, we're in the middle of this fight because this really is a fight for freedom,
Yeah.
not a fight to control the weather.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Cal, if I can also add a couple points here. Jim's point and
definitely.
your question are so important. As Jim mentioned, the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal was called the Green New Deal because the folks in the socialist Marxist left realized that protecting the environment is something that everybody says that they would like to do for good reason. So what they do is they had their Green New Deal, they call it the Green New Deal, but within the Green New Deal, very little had to do with energy, environment, or climate. There were provisions that required that there
Yeah,
be government employment available for all, government housing available for all, government health care available for all. It's basically Fidel Castro dressed up in green clothes. Similarly, at the
yeah,
United
yeah.
Nations, what they talk about is the Great Reset. Now, they call it the Great Reset. Its full name is the Great Reset of Capitalism. That's what the World
Mhm.
Economic Forum has as their central program this year. It's on their website. This is what they're advocating. And in Europe and in developing nations, where capitalism is not necessarily favored, they call it by its full name, the Great Reset of Capitalism. But here in the United States, when it's referred to, it's either referred to as Build Back Better or the Great Reset. But the Great Reset of Capitalism, what it says is that if you own a business, if you want to create your own business, run your own business, you don't get to make the decisions. Anybody who purchases your product, anybody who's remotely
Mhm.
affected by your product can tell you that you have to have, say, this percentage of people need to be indigenous employees. This amount of your product needs to be sourced from green sustainable programs. This percent has to be given back to this community, et cetera. It's replacing and redefining capitalism with socialism. So it's very important that we be aware of
Right.
that, because this is what the Trojan horse is behind the climate agenda.
Right. And in fact, a number of years ago, Christiana Figueres, at the time, she was the Secretary General of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the organization under which the UN is conducting all of this climate control business. Figueres, who is a socialist herself and the daughter of the socialist president of Costa Rica, said that the Paris Climate Summit, at which the Paris Climate Agreement got worked out, was the great opportunity to completely restructure the world's economic system, to move away from the past economic system of development into another one. And what she was obviously referring to was getting rid of capitalism and replacing it with not socialism based in individual nations, but socialism on a global scale, directed by a global governance, which points back as well to the French prime minister back in, I believe it was 1999, who said that the Kyoto Protocol was the first step toward global governance. So, in terms of their own vision, they see themselves as aiming for a complete restructuring of our economic order. And then, of course, too, even if they weren't aiming to reconstruct the economic order, to replace capitalism with socialism, they are aiming to impose constraints on CO2 emissions that would essentially make it impossible to continue using fossil fuels, force us all into wind and solar. And what would that do to our global energy infrastructure? What kind of an impact would that have on people? Uh, James, you want to start on that one?
Oh, my goodness. Well, let's first talk about the economic. In the United States, we have more oil, coal, and natural gas than any other nation in the world. And finally, after decades of dreaming of becoming energy self sufficient, we reached that under the Trump administration. For example, oil production increased by 50% in just the first 3 years of the Trump administration. We finally reached that goal of ours. And now, under Joe Biden, the aim is to dismantle that. We fought for this for 40 years after the first OPEC boycotts. Now, instead of producing our own energy, instead of not having to go beg Russia and OPEC to increase production, instead of having to worry about the geopolitical and national security concerns of getting our energy supplies from foreign nations, many of whom are hostile to us, we were self sufficient. Now we're going back to that, where most of the solar power equipment and wind power equipment come from China. Either the materials are mined and produced in China, and then the equipment is manufactured in China, or both.
Hmm.
Now, that's just the economic aspect. One other thing that's very important that we overlook is that the climate left has done a very good job of getting people to think that the only environmental issue that matters is carbon dioxide emissions. Well, before there was this so-called climate crisis, there were true environmentalists who believed in conserving land,
Yeah.
who believed in conserving open spaces. And Harvard University scientists, in a peer-reviewed study, these are scientists who believe in a climate crisis. They said, what do we need to do to get to zero carbon emissions in our electricity? And what they found is that to generate enough electricity from wind turbines to replace our conventional energy supplies, right now we would need to cover literally 1/3 of the American landmass just to produce our electricity, our American electricity
Hmm.
with wind turbines. And if we electrify transportation, which is what Joe Biden and the climate left want to do, now we would need to literally cover 1/2 of the American landmass with wind turbines. I cannot think of a more devastating environmental sentence to impose upon the creatures, the habitat, the wildlife, the vistas of the United States than what they are
Yeah.
told, what we are told we must do for environmentalism.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I just find it absolutely inexplicable that people who call themselves environmentalists would favor wind turbines or solar arrays over nuclear, over coal, over natural gas for generating electricity. They require so much more land, and they mess up the landscape, the viewscape, so much more. Uh, Jim, you live in the Midwest area, northern Illinois, and you've seen wind farms. They're not really farms; they're factories. Of course, people call them farms to try to make them sound nice, but on farms you grow plants and animals. These are wind factories, and what do they do to the landscape there?
well, they mar the landscape. I mean, not just aesthetically, but anything that moves. This talk about not understanding science, since that seems to be a big
Mhm.
topic around the United States these days, is I believe in science. Well, one thing about science is that anything that moves lets off a frequency. That includes wind turbines that are miles in every direction, and they emit or they there's a frequency in the air that has to do with the rate of their spin, and this has an effect on human beings. There are many studies, and there are towns that have wanted these wind turbines taken down because it is affecting their health.
Yeah.
This is not free, and as James said, you would have to take. It's unimaginable. It's actually it's hard for the imagination to get around the idea of how much land it would take to power all of the United States on the renewables of wind and solar. Just
Yeah.
putting aside the impracticality of it all, it is massive. You would see nothing but wind turbines out there, and then the whole infrastructure that has to be created to transfer that electricity to places where it can be used by human beings.
Yeah.
And guess what? You're not using wind power and solar power to build an enormous, 17-story wind turbine. You're using fossil fuels to do that.
Yeah.
You think about
Yeah.
what's our leaders in this country and what's going on. We're either led by morons or they're trying to destroy the economy of the United States. We had our energy
Yeah.
secretary who was asked, who laughed on television about how high gasoline prices are these days. A couple days later, Joe Biden releases 50 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and then that same energy secretary is asked on camera, how many barrels of oil does the United States use every day? She didn't know. Well, the answer is the releasing of 50 million barrels of petroleum back into the United States market was enough to last the United States consumption for about 2.5 days. And so
Yeah. Yeah.
it's completely useless. And then you have your transportation secretary, Pete Buttigieg, just the other day says, "Hey, you don't like those long gas lines? Get an electric car." Hey, dummy, what do you think's going to power that electric car? You don't like nukes. You don't want fossil fuels. Coal plants are all being shut down
Exactly.
all over the country. Natural gas projects are being shut down all over the United States. Like I said, we're either led by morons or they're actually they're gaslighting us. They're fooling us.
Yeah.
And they're doing all of this to keep us distracted so that they can destroy the United States economy and rebuild it in a way that's command and control and not free market, because they're destroying every market for energy that exists in this country that actually works.
Yeah. I do want us to get back to talking about the Glasgow Climate Summit,
Sorry about
which
that.
was our announced topic tonight. No, this is fine. This is great. But before we do that, I just want to ask either one of you to comment on some articles recently written by a mutual friend of ours, Dr. Jay Lair. He used to actually be on the staff of the Heartland Institute and still is one of your advisors. And Jay has been writing about the fact that no wind turbine, no solar panel added to the US electricity grid actually produces a net increase in energy for us. And that just seems completely bonkers, right? How can it be that if you've got a wind turbine that's generating, a megawatt hour of electricity, that it's not actually adding anything to the electricity in the grid compared with what we had before? Can one of you explain that? I think he's right on target, but it's something that most people would not think of.
Yeah,
Which one of
and
you would like?
Jay hits a great point, and the amount of energy that's required to produce wind turbines, solar panels, to get them online, et cetera. Then they are
Yeah.
producing only occasionally. Not, we can't press a button and say now we need it, kick in. Sometimes they're producing energy when we don't need it. In fact, when we sell the electricity at negative prices so that we don't have too much on the grid, then we have to try to find ways to
Mhm.
store the electricity, which we cannot do right now. And also on top of that, another point I mentioned before, the Harvard University scientists who were concerned about a climate crisis, who looked into wind power and how much land we'd need. What they also did is they determined, similar to what Jay did, they looked at the whole cycle of production of the equipment for wind turbines, solar panels, et cetera, as well as the impact, especially the drag, the wind drag that wind turbines create, the disruption of wind flow that cools the land. And what they found is not only do you have to cover 1/3 of America with wind turbines to replace current electricity, but doing so, even if we get to an all wind power electric grid, would increase temperatures because of the impact of manufacturing and placement, and most importantly, of the impact on the environment of the wind turbines taking the energy, taking the wind flow out of the land. We would see an increase in temperatures. And what this tells us is what we were getting back to earlier. This isn't about climate change. This isn't about some existential crisis, the greatest threat ever to face humanity. It is about something else. It is about an
Yeah.
opportunity to take control of the economy and Americans' lives.
Yeah. And Jay adds one other point to that, and that is that for every megawatt, gigawatt of energy that is being produced by wind turbines or electric or solar panels, the grid has to be protected against those downtimes, which means for every new megawatt of power that you build with wind or solar, you have to have the same amount of electricity being generated all the time, 24/7, 365, by fossil or nuclear backup plants running it. We wouldn't do it with nuclear, frankly, because that's just so incredibly inefficient, but it's terribly inefficient to do it with coal or natural gas as well. They've got to be running at spinning reserve all the time, and that means no matter how much more you add to the grid with wind or solar, you have to add that much more from fossil fuels. So there is no net increase uh, attributable to the wind and solar. They have to be offset because otherwise the grid will fail. It will collapse when the wind stops or the sun uh, goes blank, and the result will be blackouts, brownouts, and in some instances, even the complete destruction of a lot of equipment that's hooked up to the grid. So, this is just not something that's going to go very far. But let's get
Well,
back
if
to Glasgow. Go
okay,
ahead.
No, I was just going to add, it's like if you didn't know any better, you think that this was the plan. The plan was to cause blackouts and
Mhm.
brownouts. I think, frankly, the plan is
Yeah.
to punish humans for being a plague on the earth.
Mhm.
That's a mindset of many. Now we can get into Glasgow because that's the mindset of a lot of people
Yeah.
that were at the COP26 in Glasgow last month, or the last
Yeah.
within the last 60 days, is that humanity is a plague upon the earth, and at the
Yeah.
the most charitable way to say it is that humans need to repent and live smaller. But there's a pretty dark aspect to this whole mindset at COP26 that humans are worse than that. It's worse than they just have to be punished. Perhaps they just need to be eliminated. There should be a lot fewer of us, and blackouts and brownouts help ensure that happens.
Absolutely. I did a lot of study in years past on the attitudes toward population growth by the leaders of the world's top environmental organizations. And to a person, they pretty well all agreed that the maximum human population for the world ought to be about half a billion, 500 million. That means we need to get rid of about 7 billion of us. And they don't seem to be eager to start with themselves. But the anti-human attitude that is so common in the environmental movement just shows up all over the place, and I think this is one of the ways that it does. In fact, you might have noticed some things actually at the Glasgow Climate Summit. Can you tell us any things that you observed? Some of the NGOs present there saying that indicated their anti-human attitude.
I would love to start before we even get to that, and there's plenty to go with, but just observations about the whole setup and the people, world leaders attending. Now, we are told
Do that.
that global warming is the greatest threat humanity has ever faced. It's an existential crisis. We need to do everything possible, especially us little people who aren't members of government, to reduce and eliminate our carbon dioxide emissions. They could have had this conference via Zoom. I mean, the rest of us are told that we're supposed to, we should be able to, in lockdowns and everything else, still go about our lives via Zoom. It's at least as good. They decided not to. They could have had this conference somewhere, maybe in Central Europe, where it's a little easier to get to, especially by rail. We're told that airline travel is the worst thing you can do for carbon dioxide emissions. So they host the conference on the British Isles, where unless you live in the British Isles, you have to fly a plane to get there. And they brag about how the numbers were first 30,000, then 50,000, then 100,000 people there attending as NGOs, protesters, whatever else. They deliberately hosted it in a place where you'd have more than 100,000 people that would have to attend, most of whom would have to get there via airplane. Then on top of that, let's just look at the United States contingent. Joe Biden decides to fly Air Force One and Air Force Two to Scotland. Then you have John Kerry flying his own separate jumbo jet to Europe. You have all sorts of members of the American political class establishment, Nancy Pelosi. Here in Illinois, Governor J.D. Pritzker flew a plane out there. Don't ask me what J.D. Pritzker accomplished other than saying he was there, but spewing carbon dioxide in this major carbon dioxide super spreader event. So you have all of
Yeah.
these separate planes going out there just from the United States. Now, on top of that, when I landed here at the Heartland Institute, once we knew that the conference was taking place in Glasgow and we knew the dates, we went to immediately reserve rooms so that we could host our climate reality forum. But the United Nations had, before they announced it to the public, they had already locked up all the rooms in Glasgow. So we had to get rooms in
Hmm.
Edinburgh, which is about an hour train ride away. So I was
Right.
surprised when I landed in Edinburgh. My taxi driver pointed to the airport, to the runway as we were leaving the airport, and said, "There's your president." And sure enough, there was Air Force One, and then I guess Air Force Two, or whatever they call it, another airplane, because one jumbo jet's not enough for Joe Biden and his entourage. And I said, "Wow, isn't there? I would imagine there's an airport in Glasgow. Why did he land here?" And she said, "Oh, well, Glasgow is more industrial. This is a much nicer place to stay. Actually, Joe's staying about 2 miles that way. There's a nice estate reserved for him." So rather than addressing the greatest crisis ever facing humanity and flying, as bad as it is, flying into Glasgow, Joe Biden flies into Edinburgh because it's nicer there. And then his whole fleet of 10 or 20 SUVs goes back and forth every day, contributing to the carbon dioxide super spreader event. This tells you everything you need to know about whether or not they believe what they're telling us. If this really is
Yeah.
such an incredible crisis that we must do everything possible to eliminate our emissions, have it via Zoom, have it in a place where people can take trains to, have it in a way that the United States, Joe Biden lectures us every day, where Joe Biden, John Kerry, Nancy Pelosi, J.D. Pritzker, Leonardo DiCaprio, everyone else can jump on one plane and get there, but they don't do it. So before we even get to
Yeah.
what was happening on the ground, that in and of itself tells you all you need to know. I mean, can't Joe Biden room with, I don't know, Macron or somebody else in Glasgow if he can't get a room there? No, because he'd rather stay in the countryside and spread more carbon dioxide emissions. At that, I'll turn it over to
Yeah.
Jim, who had more observations on the ground about the protesters and what they were really there representing.
Yeah, well, as James was alluding to there, it's with these global leaders and with our basically our global ruling class, it's no change in their lifestyle at all. In fact, it probably goes up. And you're the one who has to change your entire way of living. But they won't ever, ever submit themselves to the same kind of restrictions that they would impose on everybody else. So I was on my way out of, I had to get out. Uh, my hotel was about a 25-minute drive from the airport in Edinburgh. And I gave myself a little bit more time because I had a long 17 hours of travel to go through to get back here to Chicago. And I was about 30 seconds away from making a left on the main highway to get to the airport. And along comes this long line of bicyclists that are bicycling for climate change. And they were going to bicycle all the way from Edinburgh to Glasgow the whole way. I was I was not happy. I'm not happy about that. My cabbie was also not happy, but I was probably a little testier than I probably should have been, and I apologize. They don't tip a lot or at all in Europe, but I gave him a tip just because I was kind of grumpy. But he got me to the airport on time. But behind us was a long, miles long line of cars that couldn't get through. So to protest all the CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere, if you happen to care about that, I actually don't. I don't think CO2 in the atmosphere is the control knob to the world's climate. But if that's something you care about, and everybody in Glasgow said they cared about it, the last thing you'd want to do is keep a whole line of cars out there for an extra 45 minutes to an hour to 2 hours to get to where they're going, emitting all of the CO2 into the air just to make a point. Look, guys, we got it. We know. We see protests all over the globe all the time. Let me get to the damn airport. At least move over. I'll watch you and I'll wave as I go by. But no, they wouldn't do that. And it was I got to the airport just in time. But that's the kind of the thing about these cops is that there's always a lot of theater, right? There's nothing
Mhm.
that the environmental left likes more than putting on a show, right? It's very exciting. It makes you feel young to get out there and hold a sign and ring some cowbells or all the kind of nonsense or hit drums. We went to the COP in Paris. That was the last time we did a full program at a Conference of the Parties meeting for the United Nations in Paris. It was December of 2015. We were greeted, and James Taylor, I wish I had a picture I could show it, was greeted by a wanted poster in Paris because we were daring to question their alarmist conclusions, not based on science at all. And then we had protesters outside. So, these things, it's a bit of a carnival. But I think actually the most important thing is what James had mentioned earlier, is that that was the biggest carbon event of the year, the biggest emitting event
Yeah.
of the year by far,
Far and away.
far and away. And again, that goes to the point, and I'll shut up here, but that goes to the point I started with here in this little rant, is that they will never have a smidge of a reduction in their way of life. You're the one who has to suffer. So they're doing this all for you
Yeah.
guys to save the planet and also to make
Yeah.
your life worse. Congrats.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not only all those officials, the delegates from the various governments, who came in burning petrol or jet fuel and putting lots of CO2 into the atmosphere. It's also all the various celebrities who came in. I understand that there were 400 private jets that arrived in Glasgow for the UN Climate Summit. Some of them were for officials, but most of them were owned by celebrities, by major business leaders, and so on. And for every one of those, there were more carbon emissions for them to get to Glasgow and back home than the typical American individual puts out not just in 1 year, but in about 20 years. I mean, this is clearly a matter of limits for thee, but not for me. So let's look, though, give us some examples of the actual things that particularly some of the most radical people wanted to get put into a binding agreement at Glasgow, and what happened to those initiatives, and what were the risks involved in them. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, and really, it's important to keep in mind that you have a couple different elements at play here. You have folks from the Western democracies, the bureaucrats in the Biden administration, and in the UK countries, and in their deluded attempt to believe that we can get to net zero carbon dioxide emissions, they're looking for ways to make it all happen. But the fact of the matter is, most of the countries in the United Nations are not democratic nations. They're run by strongmen, and they don't care about carbon dioxide emissions, and they really shouldn't. But basically, what they care about is an opportunity to transfer wealth from Western democracies to their own, quote, developing nations, to transfer political power, which they have very little of, because the nations tend to be stunted because of their dictatorships and lack of freedoms, but nevertheless to have a transfer of power under the banner of climate change. So what happens at these conferences, and every year you hear in the media all these high hopes, they're trying to basically talk some progress from their point of view into happening, high hopes, and it always ends up a disappointment from their point of view. And the reason is simple, because there's no reason for China, which is classified as a developing nation, there's no reason for India, there's no reason for any of these other nations to agree to restrictions when you have, especially this year, Joe Biden restricting the American economy on his own. Joe Biden making the American economy dependent upon Chinese wind turbines, solar panels, etc. Why would they even travel to Glasgow to negotiate when they're getting everything they want without giving anything up?
Yeah.
So what's being negotiated is simply this. You have developing nations that say, you give us billions and billions and billions of dollars every year, and we'll take that money and we will use some of that. They might say all of it. At most, they might use a small bit to put in wind power or wind turbines or solar panels if you pay for it. But it's basically extortion. How much money can we get out? And they never agree to binding restrictions. China, which emits more carbon dioxide than all nations in the Western Hemisphere combined, still is not, even under Paris and under any UN meeting since, is not obligated to reduce or even cap its emissions. It says basically, well, we pledge around the year 2030 that we'll eventually about plateau our emissions while we build more coal power than the rest of the world combined each and every year. So we get to this huge mountaintop of production and usage. And then we say at that point, maybe we'll keep it about there. So it's really, when you're looking at what are the extreme things that are being suggested and defined, it really comes down to this. Developing nations saying, give us money, transfer power away from yourselves to the United Nations, which we control because a majority of nations are not democracies. And from there, we'll talk about maybe someday doing what you'd like. And people like Joe Biden say, well, okay, let's try to work with that. It's a recipe for disaster for democracy for the United States.
One of my favorite parts of the COP was when the delegation from India was kind of thin, and they were like, well, okay, well, India needs to needs to start going down this way with its CO2 emissions by 2030. They said no. I said, well, how about 2050? No, I'll tell you what, 2070. Well, I'll give you 2070. How about that? So in 50 years, they get back to us in 50 years. We're going to keep building coal plants over here because we're a developing nation. We have a lot of poor people. We want to give them energy because energy is the master resource. Energy is necessary for all the creation of all wealth. So forget it. We're not going to negotiate like this. And this is something that we learned in Paris.
Which is the right thing for them to do, by the way.
Absolutely, it's the right thing for them to do. Absolutely. And this is something we learned in Paris, and I'm sure your listeners and viewers are going to be disappointed. I actually do have to leave here in about 5 minutes, so James will take you home with this. But what we learned in Paris is that these numbers are all just pulled out of the air. These are all negotiated. These are not scientific numbers. Yeah. Like in Paris, they said, if we go over 2 degrees Celsius by 2100, the planet's going to melt, right? So we should make it 1.2. We have to stop global temperature rise to 1.2 degrees centigrade by 2021. People are like, we can't do that. That's impossible. Okay, how about 1.3, 1.7, 1.5? They ended up at 1.5 as some kind of compromise. It doesn't mean anything. It's not meaningful except as a way to control the economies and the energy economies of the Western world. And so Paris, and this is what they were talking about in Glasgow as well, and James just talked about it. The Paris COP, the Paris United Nations climate meeting, was about how much money the West was going to give to developing nations to so-called mitigate the effects of climate change. Basically, again, reparations, climate reparations, because we've had it so good for so long. And all these other countries are going to be suffering, and it's our faults. We have to give billions and billions and billions to these nations. And again, as James just pointed out, these are not going to the people in these nations. It's going to the strong men and the bureaucrats who run these nations. They're the ones who get wealthy. It doesn't help the people. This entire thing is a shakedown and a scam. And these numbers that you keep hearing about, 1.3 degrees, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, it's all completely arbitrary and pulled out of the air. It's scientifically meaningless.
Yeah. I was at the COP in Copenhagen back in 2009. I think both of you were there, weren't you? And at Copenhagen, they supposedly worked out an agreement that the industrialized nations of the West were going to put together a $100 billion a year fund for helping developing nations to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And so far, I think it's about $10 billion total over the more than a decade since then has been put into that fund. It's simply not working. At Paris, they tried to reinforce that demand. No difference. At Glasgow, there were operators who were insisting that this needs to be increased to I believe it was $1.2 trillion per year that should be moved from the developed West to the developing rest. And that also is not likely to go anywhere at all. Jim, I really appreciate your being with us. If you have to leave, you got to leave. Do you have any closing comments before you leave it just to James and me?
Yes, I think the book that you offered at the top of your broadcast is well worth $100. It's probably worth $200. So all of your viewers should give $200 to the Cornwall Alliance and get that free book. And happy holidays.
Wonderful. And Jim, if you'd like, I'll send you a free copy of it anyway. Of course, you could make a $100 donation if you want to. But thanks very much. We'll be glad to get a copy of it off to you. It is a very, very good book, and I think it's something that Heartland Institute ought to be helping to distribute. So Jim Lankley, Vice President of the Heartland Institute, thanks very much for joining us tonight. James Taylor, President of the Heartland Institute, will continue with you in just a moment. Let me just remind our readers, our viewers, of how they can ask for a free copy of David Fowler's book, Restoring the Constitution Using the Ninth Amendment to Restore Civil Liberty. All you have to do to ask for your free copy is go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, make a donation of literally any size, doesn't matter how small or how big. Of course, I'd appreciate it if it were big. And as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just write in promo code 21-11 or the title Restoring the Constitution, and we'll be glad to send you a free copy. Keep in mind that this has been our offer throughout the month of November. That offer expires at midnight tonight, but frankly, if you do it in the next few days to a week, we'll still make good on that for you. So back to James Taylor. James, what did you observe in terms of divisions within the climate alarmist movement at Glasgow? Understand there was considerable acrimony between various different players there.
Yeah, and the biggest division was between the bureaucrats who are trying to preserve and protect their money and power and expand it, many of whom really do believe in a climate crisis, or this is their prime motivating factor, as wrong as they are on the scientific evidence, but nevertheless, versus the people marching in the streets, all the people from the NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that say this is an existential crisis and then fly tens of thousands of people into the UK, becoming a major super spreader event of carbon dioxide. And in the streets, when you looked at the people, and I watched some of these protests, and they were going on all week long, and they're chanting and holding up signs. And some of the signs had something to do with global warming and climate change, but most of the signs and most of the protests and most of the chants were about eliminating capitalism and having a
Yeah.
socialist world governance. And it's so funny because oftentimes people, when I mention what the true motivating factor is for these drivers of opinion on the far left and climate change, and when I mention these agendas, they say, well, isn't that a conspiracy theory? No, go to the World Economic Forum's own website and it tells you what it intends to do with the Great Reset of Capitalism. Go attend these conferences, look at the signs, listen to them chanting about ending capitalism. And the fact of the matter is, even if we got to zero carbon emissions by 2050 or 2070 or whatever it may be, that would never be enough because we'd have to give more and more money, because that's what it's about. They would never be satisfied with the amount of money that must come from US taxpayers to developing nations and dictatorships. And they would never be satisfied so long as capitalism, in other words, freedom, economic freedom, exists anywhere in the globe. Until and unless we have a
Yeah.
global governance controlling our lives, that's what the issue is going to be.
Yeah, and this is not new by any means. This has been the real driving force behind all of this for decades. When I attended the COP in Copenhagen, uh, as I spent time out on the streets, actually among the various marchers, the most commonly seen sign out there was system change, not climate change. And I talked with people who carried those signs. What are you looking for in the way of system change? And all of them, I mean, they were well programmed. All of them said, oh, we need to get rid of capitalism and replace it with socialism. Now, if anybody knows even just a little bit of the history of socialism, he knows that's not good news. That is not a promising path for humanity to take. Unless, of course, you really do want to make everyone poor. If you want to go to the Hobbesian way of life as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, as Thomas Hobbes put it in Leviathan, this really seems to be the motivating animus that we see. Um, uh, Pick up a little bit more, if you will, James, on precisely why it is that a country like India, which is, it's, I wouldn't say it's as free as the United States. It's not. There is not genuine religious freedom there, for example. But it is basically a democratic country. It has elected officials and it has elections that are reasonably fair. They tend not to be terribly corrupt in their elections. But why would a country like India be so opposed to reducing its CO2 emissions and in fact just basically say, look, we're going to stick with coal for a long time to come. And before you answer that, let me just remark too, picking up on something that either you or Jim mentioned. I think it was Jim who said, yeah, India says, well, maybe by 2070 we'll peak our coal use and our CO2 emissions. If anybody can imagine policy set by one government uh, and lasting for 70 years. I mean, just think about what happened between the Obama administration and its climate and energy policies and the Trump administration. And then between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, we've had huge reversals here in America. And anybody who thinks that a promise made today at any COP, any conference of the parties, by any government, India's government or anybody else, is still going to be binding on that country 50 years from now, just simply doesn't know anything about political history and how politics works. But
Well,
at any rate, to
that's why
go
they would
back
like
to
to
that,
have global governance.
yeah,
That's why they'd like us to cede our authority and discretion to the United Nations, and in particular to the
exactly.
climate bureaucrats who can say, well, we don't care what the people of the United States say now that they've seen the initial stages of what this transformation be, and they change. No, you will be required to do so. Getting to India, the reason why India would take the position they do is because the Indian leaders, probably a combination of one, they actually care about the Indian people, and or two, they care about their own political future. Listen, for all the talk we hear about how wind power, solar power, they're already cost competitive or economically advantageous versus conventional energy. If that were the case, you wouldn't have to force people to use wind and solar power. You wouldn't have to bribe people to do it. You wouldn't have to pass laws. You
Exactly.
wouldn't have to pass renewable power mandates. So in India, they realize that coal, in particular, and natural gas, if we were to make it available to them, are far more affordable, and they will lift the Indian people out of poverty much more readily than will wind and solar power, which will serve to tamp down, to press down the economic future of the Indian people. And when the Indian
Yeah.
government officials talk about zero carbon dioxide energy sources, they are almost always talking about nuclear power, because nuclear power is not much more expensive than coal and natural gas, especially if you remove the redundancies, the red tape redundancies we have here in the United States. Coal and natural gas are still more affordable, but with nuclear power, it's not that bad. So India realizes, first of all, it's best to stay on the path they're on. Second, if they're going to make some concessions, you make the concessions where they allow nuclear power to still be a factor. And in that case, they are looking out for the people of India because they want a nation in which people
Yeah.
can have the income so that they can have good housing, they can have good education, they can have clothing, they can have all the goods and services that people in Western democracies have without having to fight an uphill battle with expensive and unreliable energy.
Yeah, and as I understand, China, in fact, didn't even have an official delegation at COP26. And if that's the world's number one CO2 emitter, and if it is building more coal fired power plants every year than even exist in the United States, uh, you know, why does anybody think that anything to come out of Glasgow is going to be binding on the world's top emitters of CO2, India and China, along with the United States. But of course, the United States has already achieved the greatest reductions in CO2 emissions of any country in the world. And that without having been a member long term of the Paris Climate Agreement. You know, what is with how do you explain? It seems to me the failure of political leaders in the West to grasp why political leaders in the developing world simply are unwilling to jump on the CO2 emission reduction bandwagon.
Yeah, why would you go to Glasgow if you're Z, if you're leading the Chinese government? Listen, we being the Western nations, we are already restricting our energy sources. We are already self-imposing carbon dioxide reductions. As you mentioned, the United States has reduced emissions more than any other nation in the world this century. China emits more carbon dioxide. In fact, it emits more than twice as much carbon dioxide as any other nation in the world. China by itself emits more carbon dioxide than the entire Western Hemisphere. China by itself is responsible for 75% of the increase in global emissions this century. Keep in mind, US emissions have fallen by about 14% this century. Chinese emissions, well, let's say global emissions, are up by 66%. China's emissions are up by even more. So if you're China and you see Joe Biden unilaterally restricting our energy sources, unilaterally forcing the United States and pressuring other nations to become dependent upon Chinese mined materials that go into Chinese produced wind and solar power equipment, that go into Chinese produced equipment that's sent to the United States and elsewhere, why would you show up? Why would you even do anything to disrupt that or call attention to yourselves? Sit at home, as
Yeah.
Z did, President Z did, and just let Joe Biden lead the world, lead the Western world into economic destruction. And the rationale is quite simple. They have nothing to gain and everything to lose by showing up when we're already handing them the bank while they sit at home and just laugh their way to riches at our expense.
Now, maybe though, we could make a case that we all should be paying China as a way of thanking them for all their CO2 emissions, since, after all, carbon dioxide added to the atmosphere is not causing dangerous global warming, but is causing an amazing greening of the earth. It's improving plant growth all over the planet.
Right. And we know the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, they precisely measure agricultural output in terms of the full amount of crop production as well as yields per acre. And what they report is that as carbon dioxide is added to the atmosphere, as temperatures gradually warm, that almost every year there are new records being set across the globe for total crop production and yields per acre. At the same time, satellites, NASA satellites, measure that there has been a tremendous greening of the earth during recent decades, more atmospheric carbon dioxide. This is what people pump into greenhouses for a reason, to enhance plant growth. And satellites have been able to precisely measure it, where you see deserts receding, you see thicker foliage, etc. It's objectively
Yep.
measured and it's indisputable. And the things that we're told are going to get worse, hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, floods, etc. Look, the earth is a big place and these events have always happened. They're always going to happen. Global warming won't make them go away. But the fact is, we can measure the number, the amount, and the frequency and severity of these events. And what we know objectively is that they are at worst staying the same, or in many cases, they're becoming less frequent and severe. Now, when there is a hurricane somewhere anyway, the media will latch on to it and tell us, look, more climate change. This is what's happening because of global warming, without telling you that we just went through the longest period in recorded history without a major hurricane striking the United States as we're in this global warming crisis. The fact of the matter is there's much to be good, as you mentioned, Cal. There's much good to be reaped from more atmospheric carbon dioxide. We just don't hear about it because it doesn't fit in with the agenda of the left and their media allies.
Yeah. James, thank you for that. I really want to take this opportunity before we finish up here to recommend very highly to all our viewers that they go to heartland.org. That's heartland.org, the website of the Heartland Institute. This institute has been around for how long, James? When did Heartland get started? Back in the 70s, I think?
1984, Ronald Reagan's reelection year.
84. All right. Heartland's been around for a good while, and they do issues not just on climate change, not even just on environment, but on education, on all sorts of policy related to our civil rights as Americans, the Second Amendment, religious freedom, all kinds of different good stuff. Everything about trying to put government back into its proper boundaries, and to keep it from just running our lives or ruining our lives. And Heartland is one of my favorite go-to places for the defense of freedom, and defense of freedom not just in a sort of a knee-jerk way, but in a very thoughtful way, using good data to show that, in fact, when you leave people free to pursue their own interests within the bounds of God's moral law, they serve each other better than when you try to force them to serve each other. That was an insight by the great Adam Smith in his The Theory of Moral Sentiments back in 1759, which he defended in his more famous work, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, in 1776. It was an idea embraced roundly by our founding fathers, many of whom read Adam Smith, even during the Revolutionary War and before they formulated the Constitution. Freedom is the name of the game if you want human thriving, human well-being. Freedom is the name of the game, and the Heartland Institute is one of the great defenders of freedom. So, James, really appreciate the work that you all are doing at the Heartland Institute. Do you have some closing words for us as well? Can you tell us anything more that you'd like to about the Heartland Institute?
Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words, Cal, and we feel the same way about you and the Cornwall Alliance. We've been working together for many years, and you're doing a tremendous job. And I hope that viewers, if they, to the best of their ability, can support your organization. I'll just add one more thing, that this global warming debate, not just global warming, but many issues, including religious freedom, they're now being played out on social media. And you have these tech giants who have taken over. They've captured the venue by which freedom of speech, by which political ideas, religious ideas, cultural ideas are being spread. And now they've captured it, and they're looking to censor the ability of people to share ideas on this topic. And we're fighting back very hard against that. And big tech is using their power after capturing social media. Now they're trying to take away our unalienable free speech rights. They're doing it in the global warming debate.
Yeah.
They're blocking expression of speech in that realm. They're taking away our freedom of religion. They're taking away all sorts of other rights. And that's one of the topics that we at the Heartland Institute are becoming heavily involved in, and hopefully will prevail and allow reason to win out, allow people to share ideas, and rather than suppress ideas that we don't believe in. But I think God created humans to be intelligent and discerning, and given an opportunity to share ideas and reach our own conclusions, the truth will win out.
Yeah. Yeah. When James says what he says about the importance of actually sharing ideas, of having a back and forth, a debate, an exchange of ideas, I just want to further that and applaud that. One of the things that Heartland Institute does to further that is that it pretty much every year it sponsors an international conference on climate change, to which it always invites people who disagree with it, uh, scholars, scientists, climate scientists. It invites them to come and deliver papers at this conference. And unfortunately, most of them refuse to do so. If there's anything, that that reveals the extent to which these people are not confident of their position, though they constantly say, "Oh, the science is settled. 97% of all scientists agree." If you question this, you're a science denier. You're a climate denier, or worse. No, they truly are not confident, or they'd be willing to come to these conferences, deliver their papers, hear other people deliver their papers, and take part in the really vigorous debate that goes on at these. The last one was just last month. James, thanks very much for having me speak for that, along with such a stellar cast of other speakers. Just one of many things that Heartland Institute does that I find to be so helpful to the American polity, the American public. Thanks again, James. Take care, God bless, and have a very Merry Christmas.
God bless you, Cal. God bless everyone who's watching in the United States of America.
Yep, thank you. Thanks again, folks, for joining us tonight. Really appreciate your time. And one more reminder, we are coming to the end of November as of midnight tonight. And through this month, we've been offering a free book, Recovering the Constitution Using the Ninth Amendment to Restore Civil Liberty, by my good friend David Fowler. It's a wonderful book, and I would love for many of you to read this, to share it with your church pastors and other leaders, with uh, your state legislators, and so on, because this really sets forth a path by which state legislatures, governors, even county and city officials can fight back against rulings by the United States Supreme Court that really overstep the court's bounds. This is a tremendously fascinating book, and not difficult to read. It's not written in legalese, though David is a lawyer and a former member of the Tennessee State Legislature. So I'd encourage you to get this. To do so, just go to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button. And as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, enter promo code 21-11 or the title Restoring the Constitution, and we will be glad to send you a free copy of this as our way of saying thank you for your 100% tax deductible donation of literally any size. Thanks again for watching tonight. Join us again next week for From the Stacks. God bless.